They said he walked with the weight of a whole world ending, a world where hunters still followed the path of deer and farmers had only just begun to shape the land. He was one of the last men to live between those two ways of life. And for 5,000 years, the mountains kept him exactly as he fell. High above the valleys, beyond the reach of villages and herds, his body lay curled against stone, not buried, not protected, simply left as the centuries quietly folded over him. Winter after winter passed, sealing him in layers of ice that pressed and released, hardened and thawed, but never let him go. Time moved around him, through empires, languages, kingdoms, yet nothing disturbed the place where he rested. His skin darkened under the ice, his clothes stiffened into their final shapes, his tools, a knife, an axe, a quiver, waited beside him like silent witnesses, untouched by hands that no longer remembered their purpose. Inside him, something else waited too. Something small, ordinary, and deeply human. Hours before the arrow pierced his back, he had paused long enough to eat. A bit of meat, rich with fat. Grain, ground coarse between stones. Fragments of a plant gathered for reasons the mountains never told. No one knew this. Not for 5 millennia. So when 2 hikers finally stumbled upon him in 1991, they thought the body belonged to a modern climber, someone lost to cold and weather, not to a world that no longer existed. Only later did the truth surface. The ice had preserved not just a man, but the last meal he carried within him, a final act of living, held intact as if time itself had paused to watch. On the morning of September 19th, 1991, 2 German hikers were making their way along a high trail in the Ötztal Alps. They expected snow, rock, wind, nothing unusual for that altitude. What they did not expect was a body emerging from the melting ice. At first, they thought it was a modern tragedy, a climber who had slipped, perhaps in a storm. His skin was dark, his frame thin, his arms frozen close to his chest. Only a few scraps of what looked like clothing clung to him, stiff as bark. Mountain rescue teams were called. So were local police. They chipped away at the ice with pickaxes, trying to free the body without damaging it. No one imagined that the man before them had died not decades earlier, but thousands of years before any of them were born. It was only when archaeologists arrived that the truth began to settle in. The tools found beside him, a copper axe, a quiver of arrows, a knife of chipped stone, belonged to no modern era. His garments were stitched from animal hide, patched and repatched with careful hands. And the layer of ice surrounding him was not the cold of one season, but of centuries stacked upon centuries. Laboratory soon confirmed what the ice had preserved. The man was over 5,000 years old. He had lived during the Copper Age, before Rome, before Greece, before even the great stones of Salisbury Plain had been raised. The hikers who found him had not stumbled upon a victim of weather. They had uncovered a life sealed in snow, a messenger from a world that had survived only in legend until that moment. The man the world would come to call Ötzi lived around 3300 BC, a time when Europe was shifting in quiet, profound ways. Farming had begun to spread north, carried by families who planted small fields of grain as they moved. But hunting and gathering still held fast in the mountains, where game was plentiful and valleys remained wild. Ötzi lived between these worlds, a hunter who carried grain, a farmer who still needed the bow. His clothing spoke volumes. Leggings of red deer hide, laced tight for climbing. A coat patched from goat and sheepskins, sewn with sinew, grass woven into a cape that served as a blanket. Even his shoes were intricate, bearskin soles, deer leather sides, and grass stuffed inside for warmth. He carried a small fire-starting kit and a stone disc that hunters used to tie freshly caught birds. His arrows were neatly crafted, though only 2 still had points. And in his hand he held something remarkable, a copper axe made of metal nearly pure. Copper tools were precious. To own one was to be someone of skill, or standing, or both. The blade was small, but it could cut wood, shape hides, and defend a man when nothing else would. Yet for all his tools and preparation, Ötzi's body revealed a life of hardship. He suffered from worn joints, damaged ribs, gallstones, gum disease, and a parasite that twisted in his intestines. He had tattoos, 61 of them, placed on areas where pain must have been constant. He was not young. He was not entirely well, but he was resourceful, skilled, and accustomed to moving through landscapes that demanded strength. And in the end, those landscapes are what told the story of his final day. Scientists soon realized that Ötzi's digestive tract held more than a last meal. It held a map, a timeline of where he had been in the hours before he died. In his colon, they found pollen from spruce and pine, trees that grow in high, cold forests. That meant that roughly 33 hours before his death, Ötzi had been at a high altitude, moving through dense woodland. But higher up in the digestive tract, in food that had begun to break down more recently, there was pollen from low-altitude forests, species that grow around 4,000 feet or lower. So sometime 24 hours before he died, he had descended into a warmer valley. That valley was likely where he injured his hand. A deep cut between his thumb and index finger had sliced all the way to bone. Researchers call it a defensive wound, the kind a man receives when raising his hand against a blade or a blow. Whether he fought someone, defended himself, or stumbled into trouble, no one can say. What is certain is that he treated the wound with moss, sphagnum, a plant both absorbent and antiseptic. He either found it there or carried it with him for moments such as this. After tending his hand, he lingered in the valley for several hours. Then, for reasons lost to time, he began to climb. The ascent was fast, too fast for a casual journey. Some believe he was fleeing. Others think he was trying to cross the pass before weather closed in. But whatever his purpose, he climbed with urgency, gaining thousands of feet in only a few hours. By the time he reached the high ridges again, he was tired, injured, and alone. And there, in that thin air, he stopped to eat. What Ötzi ate that final time has survived longer than any recipe, any story, any record from his age. Inside his stomach were 3 distinct foods, each telling a chapter of a life balanced between old and new ways. First, red deer, meat from an animal hunted in the forests below, rich and dark. It had been roasted, leaving faint marks that still clung to the fibers. Next, ibex, the wild mountain goat of the high Alps. Its meat was tougher, but dense with fat. Fat was precious, and Ötzi had eaten a great deal of it. Half the material found in his stomach was pure ibex fat, melted and swallowed for strength. Then einkorn wheat, one of the first domesticated grains in human history. It was ground coarsely, not into a flour, but into a gritty mixture of crushed kernels and fragments. Traces suggest it may have been cooked into a flat cake or eaten warm after being pressed together with fat. Finally, there were tiny pieces of bracken fern, a plant used medicinally in many ancient cultures. Perhaps he took it to ease pain, perhaps for his stomach, or perhaps by habit learned from the people of his valley. It is a simple meal: meat, fat, grain, a hint of plant. Yet it carried the memory of a whole world: the forest he descended from, the slopes he climbed, the knowledge passed to him by those who came before. And it gave him enough strength for only a short while. Within 1 to 3 hours of eating, the arrow struck. The wound was sudden and fatal. The arrow entered from behind, its point made of stone shaped by hands from the southern side of the mountains. When it struck, it tore through Ötzi's left subclavian artery, a wound from which no man could walk more than moments. He fell. Perhaps he still held his bow. Perhaps he reached for it. Perhaps he never saw who shot him. The blow to his head came next. Whether it was the fall or a final strike from his attacker remains uncertain. But soon after, he died, alone in the thin air of the high pass he had fought so hard to reach. Snow began to fall shortly after his death. At first lightly, then heavily. It covered him, then froze, then settled in layers that built year after year until a glacier passed over the place where he lay. The mountains did what no ritual could. They preserved him exactly as he was in his last moment. His clothes, his tools, his wounds, and the quiet meal still inside him remained sealed in a chamber of ice until the world was ready to rediscover them. Most people die twice, once in body and once when their story is forgotten. Ötzi died only once. The ice refused to forget. In laboratories across Europe, Ötzi's body offered answers no written record from his age could have given. His tattoos, 61 in total, were placed not for decoration but for relief. Small dark lines ran along his spine, his knees, his ankles, the very places where his bones showed the most wear. It was ancient therapy, inked into skin long before the word medicine existed. His tools revealed his skills. The copper axe alone was an object of wealth and craftsmanship. It required smelting, shaping, and sharpening, knowledge shared only among a handful of people in his world. Its presence suggested he was respected, trusted, perhaps even a leader. His health revealed struggle. He lived with heart disease, with parasite pain, with broken ribs that had long since healed, with frostbite on his toes from winters spent climbing through snow. Yet he walked, he hunted, he carried grain and meat, he patched his clothes, he climbed mountains. He lived not as a symbol, but as a man, one of many whose names were never written, but whose lives shaped the quiet foundations of the world that followed. And in the end, the ice revealed something deeper than tools or wounds, a rare moment when nature held on to a life long enough for us to learn from it. A single man, preserved by chance, became a window into a time older than most stories we tell. Today, the path where Ötzi fell is still cold, still lonely, still shaped by wind and stone. Hikers pass through with modern boots and bright jackets, never imagining that beneath them once lay a man whose world has vanished entirely. But his story remains, not because of monuments or legends, but because of the smallest details he carried. A grain of einkorn, a strip of roasted meat, a plant gathered for pain, a tool sharpened by hand. In those fragments, the past becomes personal. We see not an age, but a life. A man on a journey long before roads, a traveler trying to cross a mountain, nursing a wound, searching for safety, stopping for a humble meal before pressing on. The ice kept what time might have scattered, and in doing so, it preserved something more than a body. It preserved a reminder that every life, even one lived before the pyramids, before writing, before history, is made of small moments. A breath, a step, a bite of food shared with no one but the self. Ötzi's last meal survived 5,000 years, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was human. And through it, the world can still hear the faint echo of a man climbing through cold air, carrying the quiet weight of his final day, unaware that time itself was waiting to keep his story.